Hi everyone, and welcome back to another episode on Tough Talk. So for today, we're going to be delving into the issue of whether or not African Australian women experience any struggles or adversity in the whole dating experience. Today, I'm joined by the lovely guests Linda and Grace. So I think let's get started into it, girls. Just wanted to bring up a point on this book from a Stanford law professor, Ralph Richard. In his book, Is Marriage for White People, he argues that 70% of black women in the US are unmarried and that white women are 2 times likely to get married, more so than black women. As an African Australian woman, do you see this to be the case for young African women in Australia?
I guess it's really important, like you said, to make sure that whenever we consider stats like that is we take them outside of the American context. So obviously in America there's a big issue with incarceration of black men, and that actually lends to why those stats are what they are. But I do think that the numbers are a little bit against us in that sense here as well, more so because we are such a young community. Africans in Australia are quite limited in numbers, and I guess unless you're dating outside of that pool, your options are limited.
Yeah, it's definitely a different context when you compare American statistics to Australian statistics. And as Linda said, there aren't as many of us, and Australia being so large as a country and a continent, we're kind of far away from each other. So actually finding sort of equal-minded, sort of similar background, African men as a young African woman is harder. So it's just that sort of has to be considered as well.
So you said finding like-minded African men is a little bit harder. What kind of, I guess, African man would be ideal that you would say, okay, that's someone that's like-minded that I could pursue a relationship with?
I guess there's a lot of different issues, I think, when it comes to, African couples getting together. I guess when I take my own context into consideration, I came here when I was quite young, and so I've sort of grown up in the Australian context. But a lot of the young black men that I meet usually come here as students, and that carries with it a lot of different issues. And for a lot of them, visa issues and getting, permanent residency and citizenship becomes a problem. So one of the ways they deal with that is finding, unfortunately, Australian girls who they can sort of coerce into marrying them. And so already you're sort of starting on a difficult footing with them. And so in that context, it's very difficult to find, for me, I guess I'd prefer someone who, or not necessarily prefer, but it would be ideal if it's someone who's also grown up in that setting, came when they were young, grew in through the Australian system. We've had similar experiences in our childhood and therefore kind of can relate on that level. So unfortunately for me, I can say that the majority of young African guys that I've met have been in that sort of category. So it's been very hard to sort of find a footing where we can even sort of start to build a relationship.
So you're mentioning that there's a limit of the number of black people that are living in Australia. Do you think, though, of the few that are here, we have some quite good candidates for engaging in relationships?
Again, I also, I guess, reference context. So I think that living in Adelaide makes things a little bit more challenging because in the dating game, unfortunately, numbers matter. And so once again, there are black women living in a community where there's so few options. It's not to say that Australia has no suitable black men or desirable black men. It's more a case of having access to those men, considering we're also spread out essentially geographically. And then Adelaide, like I said, being such a small community, doesn't have a lot of people to begin with.
I guess to put it in a numerical context, I think I read a stat that just in general, Adelaide's population, there's 7 females, single females to 1 male. So you can imagine already who then...
Yeah, wasn't it on the news that we're in a drought?
Exactly.
Yeah.
A male drought. So if you think then of the, that in an African context, it just becomes, astronomical, the ratio between men and suitable, suitable men and women. So I think that's definitely, it does make things a lot harder.
I like what you said. You said that we're a young community. So do you think that also impacts, I guess, the age and the experiences of the types of men available to us? Because if we're quite young, you'd imagine that there's a lot more immigration of families. and perhaps the demographics are, you know, teenage, young adults, not so much men that we would necessarily consider as partners. Do you think that also plays a role?
I think you did actually touch on that essentially in your own question. The number of single millennial men is obviously a lot smaller than the number of, say, middle-aged families who come here, and that's got a lot to do with how Australia essentially recruits the people who come to live here. So it's actually an immigration issue, not even a case of it extends beyond just simply dating and relationships. But what I guess I've noticed is that the men who are available and suitable are usually students, generally international students who come here, and are within a, I suppose, suitable age bracket. Not to say that you can't date beyond that, but that in itself means that there are not many international students, given the difficulties, I guess, in being in this country. It's not that easy to actually come here and stay here. So yeah, that's something to consider.
So as an African woman, does that deter you from engaging relationships? Because if you're saying that the majority of people that are here, that are available for us today, are international students, that then comes with the uncertainty of how long they will be staying in the country, whether or not you can really build a future with that person. Does that kind of, inhibit some people from engaging in relationships?
I assume that for some people that would be something to consider. I guess on an individual level, I'm not confined to this place. I guess it depends what your aspirations are. And that would be, especially if you're talking Black professional women, we obviously all have different aspirations. Some of us want to be here for a period and then move abroad or go back home. Some people are based here and are happy to be based here in the long run. So it's hard to say, but it's obviously an individual choice as to whether or not you want to commit to a partner who potentially may not be able to stay here. Yeah.
Okay. So let's talk about preferences and qualities. In an episode of Insight on ABC Australia discussing relationships, a white male claims that one of the reasons that more Black women in the US are single is a result of their high desire to date only Black men. Do you have a racial preference for who you date or marry? I guess I'll pose this question to you, Grace.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question on so many levels. I guess the first part of that question, in the sense that women, Black women only want to date Black men, is an interesting one, given I think there's been this pervasive idea that that's not necessarily the case on the opposite, that Black men don't necessarily want to date Black women. And so that definitely skews the demographics in terms of the choices that are available for Black women if Black men don't want to date them. So you're sort of choosing from a smaller pool of women. I'm not sure that that's necessarily translatable here in Australia, but I think in my own experience, have heard or sort of experienced in a sense, that idea sort of pervading even here, where you hear, some of my male friends sort of commenting about Black women versus white women and the perceived pros and cons, and, even in sort of social, pop media culture, that Kanye West song, and when he gets on, he'll leave your ass for a white girl. There's this idea that to truly have made it in life, you'll have to be dating a white woman in the end, whether you started off with a Black woman. So I think it's such a multi-layered issue. For me personally, I wouldn't say that I necessarily have a racial preference. I do firmly believe in sort of seeing the person, their character, their principles, their values, and if they coincide with mine, then great. And if they happen to be white or Asian or, Indian, that really actually doesn't have much bearing for me, but I know it does matter for some people. And I think, you have to sort of consider every situation on an individual context.
Yeah, I might chime in there as well. I actually differ in the sense that I have a preference for Black men. And I guess I'm also 100% in agreement that character and all those other factors are really important. But I guess as far as speaking into why I prefer to be with Black men, or why I tend to lean towards relationships with Black men, is I guess when you think about, and this is obviously a personal insight, but when I think about the journey that a lot of young Black people have come into accepting their Blackness, I almost think that you inherently start to, how do I put it? So I'll speak into my own personal insight because it's easier to explain, but basically having grown up in a society that makes you feel or revere white features, white men, white culture, I think there's a big or a long process that a lot of young Black people have to undergo to become really accepting and embracing of their Blackness or their Black culture. And I think in that process, when you become really actively, or not necessarily political, but when you're very active and aware of race or culture, and not in a sense of, I think we live in a racialized world, so it's hard to ignore race, basically. And so in rejecting what society has set up as these really deficit views of what it means to be a Black person, and in falling in love with Blackness, you inherently fall in love with Black men and the connection that you naturally would have with someone who shares your culture, shares your beliefs, and is also undergoing that same journey as far as navigating a world that hasn't always been so accepting of Black people. So I feel like that kind of connection is something that is really hard to find with a partner of another race. And not to say that you can't have a connection with someone else, but that's where I think a lot of Black women come from when they say that they would really rather only date their own race.
And I agree with everything you've just said. And I guess I'd want to caveat my sort of, saying that I wouldn't mind dating outside of my race, in saying that it's something that I would have to consider very, very strongly, and really have thought about all those things you've mentioned, their Black experience, because that's something you can't really share with anyone else other than another Black person, because it's such an individual and sort of intercultural thing. And one thing I am really, really against is the fetishization of mixed race babies. And I really strongly believe that you really need to have thought about that so hard, because having spoken to a few of my mixed race friends, it's such a difficult life to come up in, because you're not truly Black enough to be Black, and you're definitely not, white enough. So, where do you fit in? And I think a lot of people that I've been exposed to have been quite flippant with it. I want a mixed race baby because she'll be light and she'll have good hair. And, as much as it makes me angry, like you can get a sense that someone's not really thought about the long-term ramifications of that for their child and for themselves, because, their white family, like in this case that I'm thinking of in particular, their white family completely disregards this child. They don't exist to them. And what kind of life is that to grow up in, knowing there's a side of your family that doesn't even acknowledge you? So I think there's a merit to both sides of the argument. I can definitely appreciate where you're coming from, and I think for me personally, if I was to enter a mixed race relationship, it would be something that I'd really, really have had considered, and family, and not wanting to be in a place where the husband's family doesn't accept you, and then you're having to make your husband choose between you or their family. That's such a difficult position to put someone in.
And I think the other thing that concerns me is sometimes with interracial dating, and again, this is only some scenarios. There are obviously a lot of highly functional interracial couples, but one of the things that concerns me is that these couples can sometimes be racially blind, and I don't believe that it's possible to be racially blind. I think that you can't ignore race. How a Black person experiences the world versus how a white person experiences the world is two very distinct journeys, I guess. And so I feel like when you enter into that kind of relationship, if you're going to go into it saying that race doesn't exist, I don't believe that that's a relationship based on truth, basically. So that would be another point to consider.
I'm assuming that both of you are speaking from the perspective where the woman is Black and the male is white. Am I correct in that assumption?
I kind of just went from both ways, but speak about sort of generally.
Because I just think that the dynamic for Black men is so different. when they date someone of the opposite race. That, not to say they don't conceptualize a lot of the points that you're speaking about, but I do think they are more willing to, you know, be open to other races, to kind of give and take their culture for someone that's from a different race, and not almost hold strong a lot of the values that you two were discussing. And in what you said beforehand is that there is this aspiration to whiteness, and so there is that I want to date somebody of a lighter complexion or somebody that is more like a white person, because then I get the best of both worlds. I get this African girl. I can say to my mom, she's African, it's okay. I didn't go the other direction. But then the person that you're pursuing them on the basis that they have features that are more alike to a white person. And I guess when you go to interracial relationships, then there is the question that these black men that we have open to us, if they're not holding strong fast on their cultural beliefs, or like the need to have that cultural connection, does that also then present a barrier, because you're not going to strip away your blackness to be an ideal candidate for them to date?
Yeah, I think it definitely, I mean, having seen my brothers sort of in the dating world, I think it's such a different game for them. I can only speak, I guess, from my own experience, but I feel like it's probably a lot easier for black guys to have exposure to both black and non-black women. I almost feel like they throw themselves, you know, not black women throw themselves at black men because of, you know, the perceived, the stereotype around black men. Whereas for us, I don't know about you, Linda, but I've experienced like the opposite sides of the spectrum. You know, you come across guys who will come at you so strongly solely because you're black. And, you know, with this, I've had it said to my face, you know, I've never been with a black girl before, and you're an experience for them. They'll tick, you know, I can tick that box off my list. And then you'll get the flip of that, which they don't even know how to approach you. It's completely, like, it's so strange to me, because I almost want to be like, no, I'm a person like any other person. Ask me my name, what I do, you know, what I like to do on the weekends. So I think for black males, it's a completely different game.
I guess another point is what kind of role, we did kind of touch on it about parents. For your culture specifically, you've spoken a little bit about it. Do you think that it's more of a poignant issue for you to date somebody that is black, and you kind of have that pressure where I need to adhere to that almost guideline, if you will, that's where my dating preference should be? And, you know, sometimes it goes even further than that. They shouldn't be from such and such country. That one's, that's a big one. Yeah, do you find that that's a thing?
I guess for me, I've been quite lucky in that my parents, I've actually openly told myself and my brothers that they wouldn't necessarily have an issue with us dating outside of you know, our country, Kenya, or our race, you know, being black. And I was really grateful to them for that, because I think it took a lot of understanding and maturity, you know, progressiveness, coming from a, you know, predominantly very sort of strong African background, to actually step up and say, this is obviously a very high possibility given where I brought you, and I brought you to sort of try and advance your life, and you know, an offshoot of that will be that you're more exposed to white people, and that might be who you end up with. I think if they're honest with themselves, and if I know them how I know them, there's probably a slight little part of them that's like, God, please, like, let them be Kenyan, let them be, you know, from our tribe, if they really had it their way. But I think that took a lot for them to say that, look, it's okay, and don't feel, you know, scared to bring anyone who isn't black, you know, home to see us. So I count myself quite lucky in that regard, and that's good, because I feel like it's made me more open to sort of being a bit more open in the dating scene. And if I do end up with a black guy, it's great. But if I don't, then I feel like, you know, my family will still be very accepting of that.
Yeah. Do you share the same views, Linda?
I'm also quite lucky in the sense that my parents are accepting, essentially, of whatever decisions I make. They're also quite clear, though, that their preferences would be for someone who is African and black, but there is no pressure placed on me to deliver in that regard. But like I said, inherently it becomes my choice, and generally my choice would anyway lean towards that cultural similarity, so it works in our favor, I guess. Yeah.
Just shifting gears a little bit, I wanted to discuss a recent article that was published in Essence magazine. It was titled "Why Some Professional Black Women Still Struggle to Find Equal Partners." As an inspiring young woman, you know, we grind very hard, especially once you move to a different country. You face acculturation issues, trying to find your identity. And it's only natural that you would want somebody that has the same goals and motivations that you do. Do you think, though, that from the pool of black men, that we have available to us, that there is a little bit of a contention as to where their priorities and perspectives towards building themselves lie compared to yours?
It's a very interesting question. I guess I would say no. I think most of the young sort of black male professionals that I've come across, we do sort of have the same aspirations in terms of the grind, because not only do we have our own personal ambitions, but we do still understand the pressures that have sort of been placed upon us being first generation, you know, African Australians, and kind of feeling the eyes of the world on you, and, you know, the eyes of your parents and all your family back home. There is always that inherent pressure. So I think for me, you know, my experience, I've always found it that we've been on equal footing in terms of aspiring and trying to work towards what our ambitions are. But perhaps, Linda, you've...
I think for the most part, I agree. Like I said earlier, a lot of the people within our age group who come here are usually students, millennial students. So they are already committed to some kind of professional cause when they get here. So I think generally they are most, I guess, not to say any statistics, but there are a considerable amount of professional African men out there. I just don't think we're geographically placed to meet those people often.
You mean in Adelaide?
I think Australia as a whole. So it's such a scattered population. Obviously, there's a lot more concentration in cities like Sydney and Melbourne, to a lesser degree than Adelaide. But yeah, I don't think that there's no one out there, basically.
Okay.
But I wonder whether, and I don't know whether I may be reading a bit too much into this, you know, from the male perspective, but I wonder whether being a young professional black woman, there's already this sort of perception that we're already too strong and domineering as black women as it is, and then if we're sort of young professional women who have to be dominant because, you know, you have to make yourself known in your professional field, whether that in itself still presses an even bigger barrier for black men to approach us, because we're kind of already inherently seen as so unapproachable. So, you know, when you have the factors of geography, and then, you know, being a strong black woman and a strong black professional woman, you know, you're pretty much like a wall from the sounds of things. So I wonder whether that could sometimes pose an issue in the dating scene.
I kind of have to say that that's a really legitimate point. It's not something I haven't heard before from men themselves who say, you're either unapproachable or you're too serious or you're too difficult. So yes, there are, you know, some really, I guess, high aspiring and hardworking black men out there, intellectuals, but who's to say they want us, essentially? So yeah, that's something to consider.
And I wonder, you know, having not spoken to women from other sort of races, whether this is an issue in other races, because often I see this idea that, you know, black men don't necessarily in the end want black women, and to some extent even bash black women. You know, I don't want a black woman, and here are the many reasons why. But I just never hear that from, you know, white. I've never heard a white man sit down and tell you why he's not going to date a white woman, or an Asian man tell you why he's not going to date an Asian woman. They might not. I mean, having a preference is fine. It's your decision. But I mean, you know, to the extent that you sit down and say, this is why I'm not going to date a black woman, I think that's quite unique to us.
I don't think that opinion or that voice is quite as widespread as we think it is. I think it's just that people who hold those views are so vocal about it and so outspoken. I actually think on the whole, black men love to be with black women, and I think that unfortunately it's a pocket of that group who essentially taint, I guess, how we think black men feel about us, basically.
I just want to touch back on the point that you made, well, we kind of all made together, about Black men and their preference for the type of mate that they choose. I know that of late there has been this increasing movement of, accepting one's Blackness, accepting one's natural beauty, accepting your skin for what it is, and kind of trying to deter people from not only body shaming, but color shaming, if you will. Do you think, though, that the same kind of pride in who you are extends to Black men, in the sense that, do you think that they're slowly kind of shifting to say, you know what, I want the people that look like, to be stereotypical, like Lupita, I want people that look like Jada Pinkett Smith, I want everybody and everyone in between? Or do you think that because they're still kind of towards more lighter preferences, that also creates a barrier for us in accepting our own beauty?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think this, of late, the movement for, natural African hair and accepting ourselves in our natural skin tone, I think that's done a lot to change male perceptions of what's considered a beautiful African woman. Because, in all our shades, we've always been absolutely gorgeous. But I think it's only recently that that's kind of been brought to the fore, like you mentioned, with women like Lupita. So I think that does make a difference. But I think it's been such an ingrained societal standard for so long that it's going to take some time to really shift those perceptions. Because I think there's still, because I've actually asked a few of my male cousins and male, Black friends about why they actually, prefer lighter skinned women. And for them, they couldn't tell me why, which kind of goes to show how much it's such an ingrained thing in their heads. That it's like, I don't know why I like it, but that's always sort of what I've tended to go for. So I think it's going to take some time, but it's up to us as well to I feel, step up for ourselves, in the sense that we shouldn't sort of aim to have that validation from them. We should be sort of content in ourselves and content enough in our own natural beauty to be like, well, that's fine. If that's what you want, that's well and good, but this is how I am, this is how I look, and that's not going to change. So I think yes, it's definitely changing, but I think we probably still have a way to go.
I also agree with what you said in as far as taking ownership, and I actually think that with regards to the natural hair movement and a lot of those new perceptions on what beauty is, those are actually predominantly spearheaded by women. So essentially it's women who have basically reframed what beauty means to them, and men basically follow suit. And so I think it's really important that we continue to do that, as in taking ownership for our own bodies and how we perceive our bodies. And unfortunately, that's human nature, to kind of just follow the masses. So if we lead by the example, they will follow. But if we essentially continue to engage in colorist behavior, or I guess leaning towards white standards of beauty or other standards of beauty, then it's unsurprising that men are going to feed into that as well. So we have a big role to play in changing that.
Yeah, and I think in addition to that, in not devaluing people's experience based on their colour, I think there's still this sort of idea that just because a girl is light skinned, somehow she doesn't have her own version of the Black experience, which is still as valid as mine, regardless of the fact that I'm of a darker skin tone. So I think we need to, as African women, regardless of our shade, be there for one another, not within a context of colour. Like I'm not, we're all sort of a similar skin tone, so we shouldn't sort of be against girls that are lighter than us just because we somehow feel that their Black experiences have been much easier. Because often when you look at it, to white people, we're all still Black. We're all still, the same to them. So I think if it's not a matter of denying the fact that colorism does play some sort of role in your experience, but not to devalue that person's experience just because you feel perhaps it might have been easier for them than it was for you. I think that's often a really big issue.
So do you think there are perhaps some tools that we can give Black men to appreciate our color for whatever shade that it is? Because like you said, your brother couldn't exactly articulate why he felt that way. So, there might be this subconscious distaste towards people that are of a darker complexion, but he doesn't know where it's coming from. He's not intending to be malicious to anyone by saying, oh, I seem to have a track record of only dating people of this complexion. Do you think that there are tools that we can give Black men to kind of extract that within themselves and to look and say, oh, okay, maybe my dating history is not solely because of the person that I seem to like these qualities in each of these people, but it's more inherent in colorism?
I think just having open dialogue about I always like to think about why I think the way I think. And I think if you sort of pull yourself up and say, okay, there's actually seems to be a trend, why is that? And actually sort of sitting down and evaluating that. But I think on a broader scale, we're a very, mass consumption kind of society, and a lot of what we consume is in a media type of context. And I think if we, as young Black females, sort of try to push for images that were more representative, not just, we're not going to flip the script and just only have dark-skinned women now, but just have more diversity. I think that would go a long way in changing people's perceptions, because I think what tends to happen is, there's a lot of dialogue around it, but still all you ever see in music videos, even in African, music videos, is always, the girl in question in the video is always, a light-skinned girl. So you can't sort of be all talk, but not actually sort of have anything to show for it. So I think media would probably be the biggest tool for us in terms of really pushing for diversity, equal representation of all skin tones, regardless.
And I think, is it Wale? He did Wale and that other song, Melanin by Sauti Sol. Yeah. Like they really use their platform and use their talents to kind of showcase what you're saying is that all these different shades are beautiful. And I mean, the song was titled Melanin. So you can only take positivity from that being a Black person. Do you agree, Linda, that, we need to kind of build ourselves up, but also push for people that are in areas of influence to kind of emulate the same thing?
I agree. So we're obviously a technology-driven society. So like Grace said, seeing those images is really important. But I also think, aside from the fact that we need to push, say, people of influence, and that the pushing essentially occurs by how we consume their music. So we're the ones who buy into these music videos. So we do have a voice in that regard. But I think what technology does is it empowers us as ordinary people to be a voice. So even though whoever so-and-so is not necessarily producing the kind of content that we want to see that is representative, we have the ability to produce that content. And I feel like that's what a lot of people do through their YouTube channels, their Instagram profiles, whatever it is. So yeah, it's already happening.
Yeah. So just to kind of tie everything back in together, I just wanted to ask the both of you, what I guess maybe the top 5 things that you can say as an African woman living in Australia. We can even bring it closer to just Adelaide itself. What are the main deterrents that you think the context itself brings for dating, and then also from Black men themselves that make it harder to engage in relationships?
That's a difficult question. And I think it's harder when you put like a number, like 5. But
just to keep it short and cute,
I think the most important thing I just want to start off by saying is we use language like deterrent or barrier, but on the whole, and as this is obviously a personal insight, I feel quite positive about dating as a whole. And this is coming from someone who's quite vocally said my preference is for Black men, but I think it's because there isn't really any actual limitations. We have the ability to connect with people in ways that we've never had before. And so, and I think if you're, despite the fact that I have a preference for Black men, it doesn't necessarily mean that if I was to meet a great white man, I would shut that door completely. So I think it's just really important that I emphasize, I guess, an open-mindedness, and it's not all, dire because there's only 5 of us Black people in Australia. Like, you can actually meet someone and have a really happy and functional Black relationship with that person. As far as, I guess the question was,
You can just summarize.
yeah, yeah. So I guess I honestly think that it's probably the nature of lifestyles now. So for example, I work and I study, and that takes up so much of my time. And so coming from this background, like, it's just really hard to make time for people. And I don't think that's a Black issue. I think that's an issue of being a millennial or being a professional in this environment. So it's not unique to us, but I still think that there are ways around it anyway.
And so from the perspective of Black men, do you feel that the type of preference that you want maybe is not necessarily reflected in Australian society? Because you said you're committed to different things, you're a professional, you have so many other engagements. Do you think that perhaps the caliber of men out there are not chasing those same things, and that's why, you know, there's a little
I think
bit
that
of
there is definitely a demographic of men who are not necessarily up to standard as far as what my standards are, but I also think there's a demographic of men who are very much meeting my standards, and it's really just a matter of timing. And I guess for me as a spiritual person, divine intervention or whatever it is. But I guess the other question being what my preferences are. Obviously, I'm looking to meet people who are like-minded. It's not necessarily about like the racial aspect, but essentially you want to connect with people on a deeper level, and that's why, like I said, the preference is for Black people, and it's generally for people who are working towards the same kind of goals that I am. And I do believe that those people are somewhere within the makeup of Australian society, and hopefully it's a Black man. Yeah.
I think I second a lot of what Linda has said. I think I choose not to look at it necessarily as a barrier, but I guess you just have to be cognizant that as a young Black female, it's just going to be a little bit harder for you, and you might not have to approach things in a typical sense, and that's okay. Like, it's just, you just have to work within the context that you're living in. But I guess because of how dating works nowadays, you know, a lot of people are kind of deviating away from sort of the meeting people in bars and in open spaces and things, and going towards, you know, things like, perhaps not necessarily Tinder if you're trying to be serious, but things like eHarmony. Okay, let's just say, you know, sort of dating sort of platforms on social media. So I mean, if that's what it takes, and in that sense, you actually can sort of list what your preferences are quite openly. And, you know, I'm not sure whether it has a racial preference that you can list down, but you can do that too. So if you get to a point where you think, well, this is sort of where I'm at, then that's definitely an option. But like Linda has said, I think it just boils down to knowing what you're after and sort of focusing on your grind as it is, and then hoping that, you know, divine intervention will intercede at some stage, and you will meet someone who ticks all those boxes. I mean, obviously there'll have to be some compromises made in certain areas, because that's just life in general. But I think if the focus is more towards bettering yourself and striving towards your own personal goals, I think the right relationship tends to always fall into place with that. So that's sort of how I've chosen to look at it.
Okay, well, thank you very much, ladies, for your incredible insight and contribution to this discussion. I think that we can all agree that, you know, there's a lot more to be done in the efforts of, you know, unifying Black men and women together, and we all were committed to contributing to that. So I thank you all for your participation, and we'll see you guys next time on Tough Talk.